What if I told you that right now, without any warning signs, without any dramatic collapse or breakthrough, your entire life is quietly preparing to shift in your favor? You've felt it, haven't you? That strange stillness. Not the emptiness of depression, not the restlessness of anxiety. Something else. Something quieter. Like the air before a storm that never comes. Some people call it a rut. But you know better, because deep down, you sense that nothing is actually wrong. And yet, you're not where you used to be. And you're not yet where you're going. So why does it feel like waiting? And more importantly, why do some people emerge from this phase winning in ways no one can explain? Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, inexorably. As if the universe finally stopped arguing with them. Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychologist who mapped the hidden architecture of the human soul, believed there are moments in life that aren't designed for you to try harder. They're designed for you to realize something far more unsettling. You've already changed. Deeply, irreversibly, and you haven't even noticed. Because here's what nobody tells you. Transformation doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives in silence. And when that internal shift reaches a certain threshold, when the person you've become no longer matches the life you're living, external reality begins to respond. Not because you're controlling the world, but because you're no longer fighting yourself. Have you ever wondered why some people suddenly seem lucky? Why opportunities appear for them that never appear for others? Today, we're walking through 7 subtle internal transformations. Signs Jung himself pointed to, not always directly, but always clearly, that you are no longer operating from your old patterns, that you are stepping into the phase where your real victory begins. And here's what most self-help content gets wrong. This isn't about manifesting. It's not about positive thinking. It's not about grinding harder or waking up at 5 a.m. This is about becoming so aligned with who you actually are that the world has no choice but to rearrange itself around you. Are you ready to recognize whether this is your time? Let's begin. Number 1. The silence of the audience. Your turn to win begins the moment you stop needing anyone to clap. Think back. For years, maybe decades, you've lived as if you were on a stage. Every decision filtered through an invisible question. What will they think? You chose careers to be respected. You spoke to be liked. You posted to be seen. You even rested to avoid being called lazy. Jung called this the persona, the social mask. It's not evil. It's not even wrong. It helped you survive. It helped you belong. But here's the cost. The persona pulls you away from yourself. Slowly, gently, like a river current you don't notice until you're miles downstream. And as long as your sense of victory depends on applause, you haven't actually begun. You're still dancing for an audience that doesn't know your name. But then something happens. Quietly, almost imperceptibly. A morning arrives when a compliment lands differently. It's nice, sure, but it doesn't fill the hole anymore. And a criticism comes. Someone misunderstands you, judges you, and you notice something strange. It doesn't knock you over the way it used to. What changed? Did you grow thicker skin? Or did you finally realize that their opinion was never the point? You start asking yourself a dangerous question. If no one was watching, would I still do this? And that question, that one question, opens a door. Not to a better strategy, not to more discipline, to an inward journey where you begin to separate yourself from the role you once believed was your identity. Let me tell you about a man I knew. Marketing executive. Brilliant, but exhausted. He had built his entire online presence around appearing impressive. Every post calculated, every reaction analyzed. His mood rose and fell with likes and comments. Then one day, without planning it, he posted something unpolished, unfiltered, just a raw thought at 2 a.m. The engagement was terrible, But he told me something I'll never forget. He said, "For the first time I felt light. That was the beginning. Not of success, that came later, but of freedom." He stopped performing, started being. And strangely, when he stopped chasing attention, his work gained depth. Real opportunities appeared. Not because he was trying to win, but because he had finally stopped pretending. Have you ever noticed how desperate energy repels what it wants most? The moment you no longer need validation to feel complete is the deepest point of transformation. Imagine standing in a room full of mirrors. Every reflection shows you how others see you. You've lived there so long you think those reflections are you. Now imagine stepping into an empty room. No feedback, no applause, no criticism. At first, it's terrifying. Without confirmation, you don't know who you are. But if you stay, if you're brave enough to remain in that silence, you realize something extraordinary. You never disappeared. You were just too busy looking into mirrors to see yourself. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When you live through the persona, you think you're choosing, but you're reacting. Reacting to the need for acceptance, the fear of rejection, the hunger to be seen. But when you recognize this, when you pause and ask, "What do I actually want if no one is judging?" you enter individuation, the process of becoming yourself. And here's the deeper layer. When you stop needing validation, rejection also stops hurting the same way. Because rejection only wounds the part of you that needs approval. When that need quiets, you experience a different kind of freedom. You can be misunderstood, overlooked, even judged. And internally, you don't collapse. Not because you're numb, but because your worth no longer lives in other people's hands. Can you imagine what it would feel like to be a source rather than a reflection? That is when your turn to win truly begins. Not victory over others. Victory over the need for validation. Not standing on a peak to be seen. Standing firmly in silence, still knowing you are enough. Because the deepest victory isn't when the world says you made it. It's when you look at yourself and quietly say, "I no longer need anyone to prove that I am worthy." And once you no longer need the gaze of others to validate your worth, a deeper challenge emerges. Not from outside, from the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. Number 2, the guest in the basement. True victory is when you stop running from your shadow. Here's something most people never realize. You are not destroyed by what you know about yourself. You are destroyed by what you refuse to see. Behind every persona, behind every good person mask, lives another part. Jung called it the shadow. It contains everything you've repressed. Anger, jealousy, fear, the desire for power, the thoughts you believe shouldn't exist. And here's the paradox. The harder you try to appear good, the deeper you push these parts into the unconscious. But they don't disappear. They grow stronger. They wait. Have you ever exploded over something tiny and wondered, where did that come from? That's your shadow, leaking out when you least expect it. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." You cannot win by only focusing on your good side. Because when you deny darkness, you also reject your own life energy. And the shadow, unseen, manifests through reactions you can't control. Unexplained anger, repeated mistakes, recurring negative emotions you can't trace. You think you're losing because of circumstances, bad timing, difficult people. But at a deeper level, you're not losing because the world is against you. You're losing because you're being driven by parts of yourself you've never faced. The shadow doesn't need your attention to exist, but it needs your unconsciousness to control you. And when you don't recognize it, you call what happens fate, when it's really just unexamined patterns repeating. There's an ancient story that captures this perfectly. Perseus confronting Medusa, the creature whose gaze turns men to stone. What's interesting isn't the monster, it's the strategy. Perseus doesn't look directly at Medusa. He uses a reflective shield. He sees her indirectly, with awareness, without fixation. Symbolically, Medusa is the shadow, the terrifying part that, if faced unconsciously, will freeze you, petrify you with fear. But if you learn to see it with awareness, without identification, without avoidance, you can cut off its power. What have you been afraid to look at in yourself? Your journey is the same. Your turn to win isn't about running faster, trying harder, or becoming more perfect. It's a subtle movement from avoidance to direct seeing. When an uncomfortable emotion arises, instead of pushing it away, you pause. You recognize it. When you feel jealousy, instead of shame, you ask, what do I truly desire? When you feel anger, instead of suppression, you ask, what boundary has been crossed? Each time you do this, you're no longer dragged along. You begin to hold your position within yourself. Imagine a dark room in your house, a basement you sealed years ago. You can live in the bright rooms upstairs and pretend that basement doesn't exist. But the damp smell still spreads. The air is still affected. Only when you open the door, turn on the light, walk down and look into every corner, only then does the room begin to change. The shadow is the same. It doesn't need to be eliminated. It needs to be seen. When you begin doing this, something remarkable happens. The energy once trapped in suppression begins to release. You no longer need to maintain an image, no longer conflict with yourself. The parts that once made you ashamed become sources of strength, because now you understand them instead of fearing them. What would your life look like if you stopped fighting half of yourself? And at that moment, you reclaim control, not by controlling everything outside, but by no longer being controlled from within. So if you're still watching this, it may not be a coincidence. It may be the moment you're reminded that your next victory doesn't lie in becoming better. It lies in becoming more whole, not by removing the darkness, but by bringing it into the light. And when you do that, you'll understand your turn to win doesn't begin when you overcome the world. It begins when you stop running away from yourself. If you feel like you're entering this phase, leave one word in the comments: awake, as a quiet confirmation that you're no longer turning away, but have begun to look directly into the deepest parts of yourself. Number 3. The voice that isn't yours. When you realize thoughts are not truth, you stop self-sabotaging. But here's the thing. Even after you've faced your shadow, even after you've stopped needing applause, something still pulls you back. Old loops, repeated patterns, choices that make no sense, but keep happening. Why do you know what to do but can't seem to do it? There's a deeper layer Jung pointed to. You're not only influenced by the unconscious, you're also bound by the very thoughts you believe are yourself. You may have started to see your repressed parts, but if you still fully identify with whatever appears in your mind, you're not yet free. Because thoughts are not you. Let that land. Thoughts are not you. But for a long time, you've lived as if they were the final voice, the boss, the decider. One passing thought is enough to make you hesitate. I'm not good enough. And suddenly, you don't apply for the job. They won't like me. And suddenly, you stay silent in the meeting. The danger isn't the content of the thought. The danger is that you believe it without realizing you're believing it. Jung said, "You are not what happened to you. You are what you choose to become." But if you can't see the thinking process itself, you have no choice. You're simply reacting, a puppet with invisible strings. I once heard about a woman in finance, highly capable, top of her field, but constantly doubting herself. Every time a promotion opportunity came, a voice said, "You're not ready." No one told her that. No external evidence supported it. but the voice repeated so long it became truth. For years she declined higher positions, gave opportunities to others, until a therapist asked her one question: if that thought is just a sound in your mind, not the truth, what would you do differently? She sat in silence for a long time, and for the first time she realized she had never questioned that thought. She had simply believed it. A few months later, she accepted a new position, not because she was no longer afraid, but because she no longer treated fear as truth. What would change if you stopped believing everything you think? From a scientific perspective, this makes perfect sense. Automatic thoughts come from the limbic system, your emotional center. It's designed to react quickly to protect you from danger. But in the modern world, this system can't distinguish between real danger and psychological danger. A judgment, a possibility of failure, an old memory, all trigger the same response. Without the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for observation and evaluation, you automatically believe these signals. But when you begin to observe thoughts, instead of merging with them, you create a small but decisive gap, the gap between stimulus and awareness. And that gap gives you choice. This journey isn't about thinking positively. It's not about eliminating negative thoughts. It's about realizing that all thoughts, positive or negative, are merely phenomena passing through the mind. Like clouds drifting across the sky. They may obscure, but they are never the sky itself. When you forget this, you're carried away by each cloud. When you remember, you begin to stand as the sky, wider, calmer, not defined by what passes through. And right here, you stop losing from within, not because you no longer have negative thoughts, but because you no longer give them authority. You still hear the voice of doubt, but it no longer controls your actions. You still feel anxiety, but you no longer treat it as a signal to stop. Can you feel the difference between being swept away and standing still? Throughout this process, a subtle shift occurs. You no longer live inside your stream of thoughts. You begin to live alongside them, a quiet observer instead of someone being led. And that is when your turn to win moves to a deeper level. Not victory over the world, not just overcoming unconscious parts, but stopping self-destruction through unexamined beliefs. Because in the end, what stops you the most has never been circumstances. It's the story you tell yourself about who you are. And when you see that, you no longer need to fight it. You just stop believing it the same way. And from there, a completely new way of living opens. Number 4, the space between. Victory comes when you stop reacting unconsciously to the world. If you've begun to no longer blindly believe every passing thought, the next step isn't about controlling the world. It's about not rushing to react to whatever it throws at you. Have you ever noticed how quickly you can go from calm to chaos? There's a huge difference between feeling something and instantly becoming it. Before, whenever triggered, you reacted almost immediately. A comment touches your ego, you defend. A cold attitude, you worry. An unfavorable situation, you get angry or withdraw. It happens so quickly you think it's your true self. But in the depth Jung explored, many of these reactions aren't freedom. They're psychological inertia. Old patterns rising whenever the world touches a sensitive point within you. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." What makes you react strongly isn't entirely in the external event. It's in the part of you that gets activated by it. Someone says one sentence, but inside you an entire old defense system triggers. You think you're reacting to the present, but often you're reacting through the imprints of the past. And when this repeats, you're no longer living consciously. You're being carried away by circumstances like a door flung open by a sudden gust of wind. Let me tell you about a friend named Marcus. Works in construction. Hardworking, but easily explosive. A worker makes a mistake, he snaps. A client changes their mind, he snaps. His wife comments when he's tired, he snaps. After each time, he regrets it, but the pattern repeats. He used to think the problem was others. Pressure. Circumstances. But during a crisis, when his young son started flinching every time he raised his voice, Marcus finally paused. He told me that for the first time in his life, just as he was about to shout, he stayed silent for a few seconds, and he realized something. The anger came so fast it almost didn't belong to the present. It felt like an old switch being flipped. He began practicing something very small, not responding immediately when triggered. He would step outside, breathe, return after a few minutes. Not long after, he said something I'll never forget. I thought I was strong because I reacted fast. But it turns out strength is not letting things drag me away. What would change if you stopped being so easy to provoke? That's what many people don't realize. Reacting immediately isn't strength. It's often a sign of an inner structure that's still easily invaded. When awareness isn't strong enough, any external stimulus can take over. A look, a message, a rejection. Even a small delay can shift your entire emotional state. You don't live from your center. You live like the surface of water, constantly disturbed by stones, each impact creating new ripples. And you call that instability your personality, when it's actually the lack of space between what happens and how you respond. The image I often think of is a person holding the reins of a horse. When the horse panics, if the rider panics too, both rush into chaos. But if the rider remains steady, he doesn't need to fight the horse. He just needs to keep his grip, keep his posture, gradually guide the movement back. The human psyche is the same. Stimuli from the world are like a sudden pull of the horse. Awareness is the hand holding the reins. Victory isn't about never being triggered. It's about still holding the reins when you are. That conscious pause is the clearest sign of inner maturity. It may only last a few seconds, but within those seconds, the entire fate of a reaction can change. You no longer say things you regret. You no longer decide from anger, fear, or wounded pride. You begin to see that between what the world does and what you choose to do next, there is always a small space. Have you found that space yet? And the moment that space appears, that is when your turn to win truly begins. At that point, you're no longer a victim of circumstances. Circumstances can still be difficult. People can still hurt you, but they no longer have full control over your state. If what you just heard makes you realize you're no longer reacting as before, leave a like on this video. Not to support me, as a quiet confirmation that you've begun to hold the space between the world and yourself. Sometimes just one unhurried moment is enough to remind you of what old reactions once obscured. You're no longer being swept away. You're gradually mastering how you show up. Number 5. The compass, not the weather. When you're no longer dependent on emotions to act, you begin to lead your life. Once you can hold the pause between stimulus and response, a deeper question arises. If emotions no longer decide your actions, what does? Have you noticed how unreliable feelings are as a guide? Emotions aren't always a reliable compass. There are days when you feel energized, clear, ready to move forward. There are also days when you feel tired, doubtful, even wanting to stop. If your actions depend entirely on those fluctuations, your life becomes inconsistent, like a boat pushed by waves, instead of having its own direction. According to Jung, consciousness isn't only awareness. It's also the ability to direct psychological energy. That means you don't need to feel right to do what's right. You need an inner axis strong enough that your actions aren't dependent on temporary states. Jung once wrote, "Freedom of will is the ability to do gladly that which I must do." Freedom isn't following emotions. It's the ability to act in alignment with what's meaningful, even when emotions don't support it. When you haven't reached this stage, you live by impulse. Motivated, you move forward. Unmotivated, you stop. Feeling good, you do more. Feeling bad, you let go. But when you begin to separate action from emotion, another kind of strength appears. Not loud, but stable. You no longer need inspiration to begin, because you already have a clear direction within yourself. Consider the story of Michael Jordan, one of the greatest athletes in history. He wasn't always in his best state. Not every game began with absolute confidence. But what made him different wasn't emotion. It was consistency in action. Even after failures, even after being cut from teams, he continued to train, repeated basic moves thousands of times, not because he always wanted to, but because he understood that was the only path forward. What if success wasn't about motivation but about movement? He once said he failed again and again, and that's what made him succeed. What matters isn't explosive willpower in a single moment. It's the ability to continue even when the feeling of victory is no longer there. This reflects a clear mechanism in neuroscience. Emotions often originate from older systems in the brain, reacting quickly but not stably. Long-term directed actions require the prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning, values, and goals. When you act based on emotions, you're pulled by short-term signals. When you act based on values, you begin to restructure how energy is used in the mind. Over time, this creates inner stability where action no longer depends on state, but is sustained by internal clarity. Think of a mountain climber in fog. There are moments when he sees the peak clearly, stepping forward with confidence. But there are also moments when fog covers everything. The path ahead disappears. If he only continues when he can see clearly, he stops many times. But if he trusts the compass in his hand, he continues step by step, even without visibility. Life is the same. Emotions are like visibility, sometimes clear, sometimes obscured. Values are the compass. Are you following your feelings or your compass? When you learn to follow the compass instead of waiting for visibility, you're no longer trapped by days without motivation. And right here, victory is no longer rare breakthrough moments. It becomes a repeated, stable, sustainable process. You're no longer dependent on feeling ready to act. You don't need a perfect state to move forward. You begin to lead your life, not by temporary emotions, but by consistent choices. Because in the end, what creates the difference isn't the days you feel strong. It's the days you continue even when you feel nothing special. And when you can do that, you're not just moving forward. You begin to become the one who directs your own path. Number 6, the sacred solitude. When you accept loneliness as part of the individuation journey, everything changes. There's a very particular phase in the process of individuation that Jung called necessary separation. You begin to leave behind old patterns, old relationships, ways of thinking that once made you feel safe. But at the same time, you haven't yet fully stabilized in a new identity. This isn't disorientation in a negative sense. It's a transition. You no longer fit the old world, yet you can't fully integrate into a new one built from within yourself. And in this space, a sense of loneliness appears. Not loud, but unmistakable, like a gap that no one else can step into for you. Have you ever felt alone in a room full of people who love you? This loneliness is different from the loneliness you once knew. It doesn't come from the absence of people. It comes from the fact that no one can fully understand what's happening inside you anymore. You may still be among friends, family, colleagues, but some part of you no longer speaks the same language as they do. Things that once excited you now feel distant. Conversations that once felt familiar now feel shallow, and you begin to realize that your journey cannot be fully shared. This isn't a sign that you're going the wrong way. It's a sign that you're going deeper. I once knew a woman who went through such a shift. For years, she lived according to very clear family expectations. She did things right, chose a stable career, built a life based on accepted standards, kept everything under control. But after a long time, she began to feel a subtle misalignment inside, as if her life no longer fully matched who she truly was. When she began to change, small choices first, then new ways of thinking, then daring to refuse what no longer fit, she not only lost familiarity, she felt herself gradually separating from those around her. At times she wondered whether she was becoming difficult, distant, but the more she tried to return to how things were, the more alien she felt to herself. Only when she accepted staying in that loneliness, without rushing to fill it, without rushing to explain, did she begin to feel something else, a deeper quiet, where she no longer needed to fit into any pattern. What if the loneliness you're avoiding is actually birthing you? And in that very silence, you begin to realize something subtle. When no one is defining you, you no longer have to constantly become something. You can simply exist, without proving, without explaining. The paradox is that the very loneliness you try to avoid is what creates your unique identity. When you're no longer surrounded by constant external feedback, you begin to hear more clearly what comes from within. Your choices are no longer immediately validated, but they become more authentic. You no longer live to be understood. You begin to live in alignment with yourself, even when it can't be fully expressed to others. And that's something very few people accept. Inner growth always comes with a certain degree of loneliness. Not because you're separated from the world, but because you're stepping out of old versions of yourself. What once held you no longer has enough power. But what is new is still forming. This is not a void that needs to be filled. It's a space that must be held, long enough for a deeper identity to emerge. At this point, the journey opens into an entirely new depth. It's no longer about winning over the need for validation. No longer about overcoming unconscious parts or limiting thoughts. It's about the ability to remain with yourself, even when there's no one left to reflect you. When you can pass through this phase without turning back, you don't just become stronger, you become more real. Because in the end, the deepest victory isn't belonging somewhere. It's no longer needing to belong in order to feel whole. Can you sit with yourself when no one else is watching? If you've been through or are currently in this quiet space, share your story in the comments. Sometimes telling your journey not only helps you see yourself more clearly, but becomes a small light for someone else silently walking the same path. Number 7. The world begins to sign. When you're able to stay with yourself in loneliness without rushing to fill it, something very strange begins to happen. The external world no longer seems as random as before. There are moments when you meet the right person at the right time. Read exactly what you need to read. An opportunity appears just when you're ready to step into it. Before, you might call it luck, coincidence, chance. But when your inner journey goes deep enough, you begin to perceive these things differently, as if a subtle alignment is taking place between your inner world and the outer world. Have you ever experienced a coincidence that felt like more than coincidence? Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity. Meaningful coincidences, not caused directly, but connected at a deeper level of reality. He once wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." That doesn't mean the world changes. It means the way you see and live begins to change. When you're no longer pulled by old patterns, you become more aligned with yourself. And that alignment creates a kind of resonance with the world around you. Not because you control everything, but because you're no longer off your own axis. I once spoke with someone who went through this transformation after leaving a stable job to pursue a path he couldn't fully explain. At first, everything was unclear. No plan, no guarantees. Only a deep sense that he couldn't go back. In the first months, he lived almost entirely in uncertainty. But then, strange things began to happen. One time, he randomly met someone in a cafe who later introduced him to a project perfectly suited to his abilities. Another time, he picked up a book that contained exactly the ideas he'd been struggling to express. Small pieces began to appear, not according to plan, but connecting in meaningful ways. After a while, he said something I still remember. "I no longer feel like I'm searching for the path. It feels like the path is revealing itself as I walk in alignment with it." What matters here isn't the external events. It's your internal state when they occur. If you're still living in doubt, reaction, or trying to control everything, these coincidences will pass without leaving a trace. But when you're still enough, clear enough, honest enough with yourself, you begin to perceive another kind of order. Not logical order, the order of meaning. What if life has been trying to guide you all along, and you just couldn't feel it? Imagine a radio. When the frequency is off, you hear only noise, fragmented sounds, static. But when it's tuned correctly, everything becomes clear, as if the signal was always there, just waiting for you to align with it. Life is the same. Opportunities and signs don't appear more. You begin to tune into them when you're aligned with yourself. And here, your turn to win is no longer a sudden explosive moment. It becomes the natural result of alignment. You no longer feel the need to force things to happen, nor do you worry about whether it's the right time. When you live in alignment with yourself, timing is no longer something you wait for. It begins to appear as part of the path you're already on. What you once called opportunity becomes a reflection of your inner state. What you once called luck becomes the result of inner consistency. And what you once called fate is no longer something that happens to you. It becomes something you consciously participate in. So if recently you've begun to notice meaningful coincidences, unexpected connections, doors opening just when you stop trying to force them, it may not be random. It may be a sign that you're moving into your correct trajectory. And when that happens, you'll understand. Your turn to win isn't a moment given to you. It's the point where the inner and outer finally meet. Conclusion: the unfolding. There are people who enter this phase of life without any loud signal announcing it. No golden moment. No dramatic turning point. Just a very deep inner shift. And then everything begins to move. Not because they become different in the eyes of the world, but because they are no longer separated from themselves. And when that happens, your turn to win is no longer a distant hope. It becomes an unfolding process. What makes this journey special isn't what you achieve, it's who you no longer need to pretend to be. You no longer chase reflections, no longer get pulled by unconscious parts, no longer wait for perfect conditions to begin. You simply stand firmly in yourself. And from there, life begins to open in a different way. If this video helps you realize that you're in such a phase of transformation, share it with someone who is also on this path. They may need a sign too. And if you want to continue exploring the psychological dimensions that Carl Jung once revealed, subscribe to the channel to continue walking with us. Because this is not a journey for you to conquer the world. This is a journey for you to stop losing yourself.